Have you ever wondered why someone who once showed interest suddenly goes quiet? Why a man who seemed to crave your energy, your presence, your love, suddenly vanishes into silence? This silence isn't always rejection, sometimes it's revelation. In this speech, we uncover the truth behind male silence, what it really means, and how you can rise above emotional confusion and take back your power. You see, when someone goes silent on you, especially someone who once craved your attention, your presence, your energy, the natural reaction is confusion. You start asking questions that echo in your own mind. Did I do something wrong? Did they lose interest? Were the feelings ever real? But before you spiral into self-blame, understand this. Silence is not absence. Silence is communication. It's just a different language, one most people never learn to read. When a man goes quiet, he isn't always pulling away. Sometimes he's processing. And that's an important distinction. Many men are taught to suppress emotion, not to express it. They're conditioned to appear composed, even when their inner world is chaos. So rather than speak, they retreat. Rather than confront, they contain. That silence becomes a shield, a way to maintain control, to avoid vulnerability, or even to protect themselves from what they feel. But here's the truth that stings a little. Silence also reveals where someone stands emotionally. It's a mirror. And when you stare into that mirror, you'll see the truth of their emotional capacity. A man who values connection but lacks maturity will always choose avoidance over honesty. Because honesty requires courage. And courage, when it comes to the heart, is something only a few possess. Now, I want you to think about something deeper. Silence isn't always personal. Sometimes it has nothing to do with you. It's about his internal war between desire and fear, craving and control, emotion and ego. He might crave you, yes, but that craving can terrify him. Because craving means vulnerability. It means he's no longer in complete command of his emotions. And that loss of control, that surrender, feels dangerous to someone who hasn't mastered his own emotional world. In psychology, there's a term called avoidant attachment. It describes people who feel connection but run from it at the same time. They crave closeness, but when it becomes too real, too intimate, they step back. Not because they don't care, but because caring exposes their wounds. Silence in that case is protection, not punishment. But here's the catch. Even if it's protection for him, it becomes punishment for you. That's why you must learn to read silence with wisdom, not desperation. Instead of asking, why isn't he speaking? Ask, what is this silence trying to show me? Because it's showing you something. It's revealing where he stands, and it's also testing where you stand. Will you chase noise, or will you find peace and understanding? There's power in not reacting to silence. There's strength in observing it instead of filling it with anxiety. Every time you respond to silence with composure, you demonstrate emotional intelligence, something far rarer and far more magnetic than neediness. You shift from being controlled to being centered. That's the real lesson here. Silence has a rhythm, a pattern, a meaning, but it only speaks to those who listen without panic. If he goes quiet, it doesn't mean your worth has diminished. It means his communication has retreated. And in that space, your self-awareness must step forward, because how you handle that space determines whether you grow from it or get lost in it. So don't rush to decode his silence. Let it expose his truth. Let it show you whether he's capable of emotional presence or only emotional withdrawal. Let it teach you patience, discernment, and self-respect. Because sometimes the most revealing thing a person ever says to you is nothing at all. And when you learn to understand that silence without losing yourself, you've already won. Let's talk about control. Not the kind that's loud or obvious, but the kind that hides in silence. See, emotional distance can be one of the most subtle forms of control a person can use. When someone suddenly pulls back, when they withdraw their energy, their attention, their words, it creates imbalance. You start to feel uncertain. You question yourself. You begin to chase clarity. And the more you chase, the more power you give away. That's how control through silence works. It shifts the dynamic without a single word being spoken. It turns your natural desire for understanding into emotional dependency. It makes you start doing the emotional labor, reaching out, overthinking, apologizing for things you didn't even do. That silence becomes a psychological tool, a way to keep you guessing and therefore attached. Now, this isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's subconscious, but that doesn't make it any less real. Many people, especially men who have learned to equate emotion with weakness, use withdrawal as a way to regain their sense of dominance. When they feel like they're losing control of the narrative, they go quiet. When they sense you're growing confident, detached, self-assured, they retreat, hoping that absence will make you anxious enough to pull them back in. And this is where you need to pause and observe, not react, because that's the turning point. If you respond to that silence by chasing, you reinforce the behavior. You teach them that they can get your attention, your energy, your concern, simply by withholding theirs. But if you hold your ground, if you remain calm and collected, you shift the power dynamic entirely. You teach them that silence doesn't move you, self-respect does. There's a psychological concept called intermittent reinforcement. It's when attention, affection, or validation is given inconsistently. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. This inconsistency actually deepens emotional attachment because your mind starts craving the next hit of reassurance. Silence, when used strategically, operates in that exact way. It hooks your emotions by creating uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the most addictive emotional states there is. But here's what they don't expect. Emotional awareness breaks the cycle. When you start recognizing silence as a tactic rather than a mystery, it loses its power. You stop interpreting it as rejection and start seeing it as revelation. You start to realize that anyone who relies on emotional withdrawal to maintain control isn't leading from strength. They're operating from fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of losing power, fear of genuine connection. You see, true strength doesn't manipulate. True strength communicates. It doesn't retreat to create confusion. It stays present to create clarity. That's what emotional maturity looks like. Presence, not performance. So when someone's silence starts to make you feel small, remind yourself, that's not power, that's avoidance, that's not mystery, that's manipulation disguised as restraint. You don't owe anyone endless understanding when they refuse to offer basic honesty. You don't have to chase someone who is using absence as a weapon. Your job isn't to decode someone's silence, it's to honor your own peace. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Not texting, not over-explaining, not begging for closure, just silence in return, but this time silence born from strength, not confusion. Because when you stop reacting to their distance, you reclaim your energy. You stop dancing to a rhythm designed to disorient you. You show them and yourself that emotional control doesn't come from manipulation, but from mastery. So the next time someone uses silence to test you, don't break your composure. Don't let it define your worth. Stand tall in your calm. Because people who rely on silence to control you only win when you let their absence disturb your peace. The moment you realize that silence cannot control a mind anchored in self-respect, that's the moment you take your power back. Let's get something clear. Craving someone and being ready for them are two completely different things. You can crave connection, crave intimacy, crave the warmth of another person's energy, and still not be prepared to handle what that connection demands. And this is where many people, especially men, get trapped. They feel the pull, they feel the chemistry, but when the emotional weight of it all shows up, they freeze. They crave you, but they're not ready for you. You've probably seen it happen. The calls, the attention, the compliments, all pouring in when things are light, easy, exciting. But the moment it gets real, when emotional depth enters the picture, suddenly that same person begins to withdraw. Their energy changes. They start taking longer to respond. They create distance, and you're left wondering what happened. What happened is that the fantasy met the reality, and they weren't ready for that collision. See, craving is driven by desire, but readiness is defined by discipline. Desire wants pleasure. Discipline can handle pressure. Anyone can want you when it's convenient, but only someone who's emotionally mature can show up for you when it's complicated. This is where the psychology gets interesting. Many people chase the feeling of connection without understanding the responsibility that comes with it. They want the emotion, but not the evolution. They want the experience of being close without the vulnerability that true closeness requires. Because vulnerability, real, raw vulnerability, demands courage. It exposes insecurities, old wounds, the fear of being seen fully and still not being enough. And that's a level of self-awareness most people avoid. What happens? They crave the energy of connection, but can't sustain the emotional consistency that real love, real partnership, or even real friendship demands. They're like someone who wants to swim but fears the depth. They stay near the shore, splashing in shallow waters, convincing themselves they re-swimming when they've never actually learned how to float when it gets deep. And here's where you have to be careful, because when someone like that craves you, their pull can feel powerful, their attention can feel intense, intoxicating even. But intensity is not stability. Chemistry is not compatibility. You cannot build something real with someone who's drawn to your light but terrified of its heat. Now, I know that can be difficult to accept, especially when you feel a connection. You want to believe that if they just see your worth, they'll rise to the occasion. But people don't grow because you love them deeply. They grow because they choose to confront themselves honestly. You can inspire growth, but you cannot force readiness. That's why emotional boundaries matter. You have to recognize when someone's craving is temporary, when it's rooted in loneliness, ego, or fantasy. Because if you ignore the difference between craving and readiness, you'll keep trying to build a foundation on unstable ground. And what happens when you do that? The moment life applies pressure, everything cracks. So if someone's silence follows their craving, understand that it's not always rejection. Sometimes it's exposure. It's exposing their emotional limits, showing you exactly how far they're willing to go. And your job isn't to drag them past those limits. It's to observe and decide whether that's enough for you. The truth is, some people crave your presence because it makes them feel alive. But that doesn't mean they can nurture that aliveness consistently. And you can't spend your life watering someone's garden if they refuse to plant their own seeds. So here's the wisdom. Don't confuse desire with devotion. Don't mistake attention for intention. Someone craving you doesn't mean they're capable of keeping you. Emotional readiness is measured by consistency, not intensity. And when you understand that difference, when you stop mistaking craving for commitment, you protect your peace, your energy, and your dignity. Because the one who truly deserves you isn't the one who craves your energy, but the one who's prepared to carry the weight of your presence with grace. Sometimes silence doesn't come from disinterest, it comes from fear. And not the kind of fear you might imagine. I'm not talking about fear of rejection or embarrassment. I'm talking about fear of you. Fear of your strength, your self-assurance, your emotional intelligence, your light. There are people who crave that light, but the closer they get to it, the more it exposes them. Their insecurities, their lack of direction, their emotional unreadiness. And instead of rising to meet that light, they pull away from it. They go silent. See, when a man is truly confronted with someone who knows their worth, it challenges him in ways he didn't expect, because now he can't just rely on charm or surface level effort. He has to show up, and showing up requires self-awareness, honesty, and humility. It demands that he faces himself, his fears, his ego, his past, and that's not something everyone is ready for. So rather than communicate his struggle, he disappears into silence. Because silence feels safer than accountability. It's easier to say nothing than to admit, I don't feel good enough for you. It's easier to retreat than to reveal, you make me see parts of myself I've been avoiding. That's the psychology behind fear-based silence. It's not about you being too much. It's about you being too real for someone who's built their identity on comfort. But this is where your mindset matters most. Because when you start seeing silence through the lens of fear, you stop internalizing it as rejection. You start realizing that your strength can be intimidating, not because it's aggressive, but because it's unwavering. In a world where so many people survive off emotional chaos, calm confidence can feel like a storm. Think about it. When you operate from self-respect, from clarity, from peace, it forces the other person to either elevate or exit. And when they're not ready to elevate, their instinct is to withdraw. It's human nature to retreat from what exposes your weaknesses. So his silence might not be punishment. It might be protection. Protecting his ego, protecting his illusion of control, protecting the image he's built to hide the parts he hasn't healed. But here's the trap. If you take his fear personally, you'll start dimming your light to make him comfortable. You'll start shrinking your power to fit into the space his insecurity created. And that's how too many strong people lose themselves. Not because someone broke them, but because they chose to play small to keep someone else around. Don't do that. Don't silence your voice to keep someone who can't handle your volume. Don't question your confidence because someone else is intimidated by it. Their fear is not your responsibility to manage. Your responsibility is to remain grounded in your truth, to stay consistent in who you are, regardless of who stays or who goes. Fear-driven silence often reveals one of life's greatest truths. Not everyone you attract is meant to accompany you. Some are just mirrors, reflecting how powerful you've become. And once they see their own reflection next to yours, they realize they're not ready to grow at that level, so they vanish. And that's okay, because the ones who are meant for you won't be silenced by your strength, they'll be inspired by it. So when someone's silence feels confusing, take a breath and remember, your presence alone can awaken what others have spent years avoiding. You are not the reason they're quiet, you're simply the reason they can no longer pretend. And that's why you should never lower your frequency to be understood by those still learning to tune into truth. Because the moment you stop shrinking to make fear feel safe, you become the very definition of power, calm, unbothered, and free. How you respond to silence says more about you than the silence itself ever could. That's where the real test begins, not in what they do, but in how you choose to handle it. Because in relationships, in connections, in life, control isn't about what happens to you. It's about how you respond when it does. And when someone you care about goes quiet, that's when your emotional discipline gets tested. Most people react to silence emotionally, not consciously. They panic, they start chasing, over-explaining, replaying every conversation, trying to find what went wrong. That reaction is human. It's your mind seeking safety, your ego demanding closure. But when you let that reaction lead, you surrender your peace to someone else's behavior. You hand over your power without realizing it. And the more you chase answers from someone who's withdrawn, the further you drift from your own clarity. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't care or communicate. I'm saying there's a difference between responding and reacting. Responding means you take a moment to step back, observe the situation, and act from self-awareness, not desperation. Reacting means you let fear speak first. And fear, when it drives your words, rarely says anything wise. Think about it. When someone goes silent, it's not just a pause in communication, it's a moment that reveals emotional alignment. It shows you who can handle discomfort and who can't. It shows you whether you're rooted enough to stay centered or whether you need their validation to feel grounded. Because silence doesn't just test your patience, it exposes your dependence. And that's the truth most people don't want to face. We think strength is about confrontation, but sometimes strength is restraint. It's the ability to sit in uncertainty without losing your composure. It's the maturity to say, I don't need to chase what's already showing me its inconsistency. That's power, quiet power. There's a reason emotionally grounded people seem unshakable. It's not because they don't feel deeply, they just refuse to let emotion dictate direction. They've learned that not every silence deserves a response, and not every withdrawal deserves pursuit. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let distance reveal intention. Because when someone pulls back, they're telling you something, even if they never say a word. And when you don't react, when you hold your peace instead of fighting for their presence, something interesting happens. The dynamic shifts. You stop feeding the imbalance. You stop rewarding emotional inconsistency. You start teaching people how to treat you, not through lectures or ultimatums, but through calm, unwavering self-respect. That silence on your part becomes a mirror. It forces them to confront themselves, to realize that your stability doesn't depend on their approval. And that's when the balance of power resets. Because in every relationship, energy either flows from need or from strength. When you operate from need, you chase. When you operate from strength, you choose. And choice will always command more respect than chase ever could. But this requires something deeper than confidence. It requires self-trust. You have to trust that holding your peace won't make you lose something meant for you. You have to trust that silence, handled with wisdom, can protect you from emotional games that words can't fix. And you have to trust that maturity isn't found in reaction, but in restraint. So the next time someone's silence tempts you to lose your composure, remember this. Your reaction defines the story. You can turn silence into confusion, or you can turn it into clarity. You can let it break your peace, or you can let it build your power. Because the way you handle silence is the way you teach the world how to treat you, and those who deserve your presence will never make you beg for it. When someone goes silent, your first instinct might be to fill the space, to fix it, to explain it, to reach for clarity. But what if that silence isn't meant to break you? What if it's meant to build you? See, the silence you face isn't just their absence. It's your opportunity. It's the moment life hands you a mirror and asks, what will you do when validation is gone? When attention fades? When love feels uncertain? That moment right there is where transformation begins, because silence has a way of showing you what noise once hid. When someone's voice disappears, your own gets louder. You start to hear the thoughts you've been ignoring, the truths you've been avoiding. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that silence is your call to evolve. Not to chase, not to question your worth, but to rise. See, growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens in confusion. It happens in stillness. When the person who used to reassure you is no longer there, you learn to reassure yourself. You learn to hold space for your emotions instead of running from them. You learn to stop defining your value by who stays and start defining it by how you stay true to yourself when others leave. There's something deeply spiritual about that process. Because every silence you face is an invitation to meet a stronger version of you, the version that doesn't need constant affirmation to know its own worth, the version that doesn't chase what withdraws, the version that can sit alone and still feel full. But let's be real, it's not easy. Growth never is. Silence can feel heavy. It can make you question your significance. It can make you doubt everything you thought was real. But that discomfort is not punishment, it's purification. It's clearing out the parts of you that depended too much on others to feel whole. It's stripping away illusions so that you can rebuild from truth. The irony is, the very thing that once hurt you, the silence, the distance, the unanswered questions, becomes the soil where your strength takes root. That's where resilience is born. You stop seeking closure and start creating peace. You stop demanding explanations and start trusting alignment. You begin to understand that anything or anyone that disappears was never meant to sustain your foundation. They were meant to awaken your awareness. This is where the shift happens. Instead of seeing silence as rejection, you start seeing it as direction. Life doesn't remove people to punish you. It removes them to prepare you. It's redirecting you towards spaces that match your growth, not your wounds. Because sometimes you can't hear your next calling over the noise of comfort. And sometimes silence is the only way the universe can get your attention. So instead of mourning the quiet, learn from it. Instead of chasing noise, create stillness. Use that space to rebuild your focus, refine your purpose, and rise with more clarity than you've ever had before. Because every time you survive a silence, you're not just healing, you're evolving. You're mastering the art of being complete, even when life feels incomplete. And one day when you look, you'll realize the silence that once scared you became the very sound of your awakening. It was the moment you stopped trying to be understood and started understanding yourself. So don't break under silence. Build through it. Don't fear the stillness. Find yourself in it. Because when you learn to rise through silence, you don't just win back your power. You become the kind of person who no longer needs noise to feel whole.